Hello there, I'm Chuck Todd, and welcome to another episode of Meet the Press Reports. This week, we are looking at the roots of our country's polarization. Look, it's no secret this country is deeply polarized. Just take a look at Washington and take a look at it by the numbers. Our current Senate, dead even, 50-50 split. The House is nearly dead even, 220 to 212. And the 2020 election, exactly 25 states gave their electoral votes to Joe Biden, and the other 25 states went to Donald Trump. And those divides are becoming pretty baked in. In fact, 44 of the 50 states have voted for the same party in at least 5 of the last 6 presidential elections. It is pretty remarkable. And it has created an environment in which so much now is seen as a partisan attack. Working with the other side on any issue is viewed as betraying your team and giving the bad guys a win, whoever you think the bad guys are. And when the rule of law is upheld against a former president, there's suddenly talk of civil war by right-wing extremists online. So we're in quite a moment here as a nation, and there's perhaps no better example of our national divisions than the state of Wisconsin. The state's unique political, geographical, and cultural dynamics have made it ground zero for our nation's polarization. Wisconsin's actually been dealing with these bitter divides for over a decade, maybe their patient zero. So I traveled there to take a look at where these divisions came from and what the rest of the country might be able to learn from this microcosm of America.
Go, Birds, go!
At Green Bay's first home game of the season, the Packers bring Wisconsin's red and blue voters together.
3.5 hours every single week. People put their political needs aside and they just want to cheer for the green and gold.
It can take people from either side of the political spectrum and bring them together.
Packers. Of course, Packers.
But even at Lambeau Field, political divisions calcified by a decade of tribal politics are impossible to escape.
An election year like this, you can kind of feel it in groups of people, maybe a little bit of tension if they know that someone's on the opposite side of the political spectrum.
Sure, I have political divide in my own family if we talk politics.
Some people in my friend group have left our group just based on like political views.
Not a year goes by without at least one statewide race dividing Wisconsin. And 2022 is no different, as the state hosts 2 nationally watched nail-biters, with both the Senate and governor races up for grabs and on a knife's edge. What's unclear about this divide is whether the state even has many voters who vacillate between the 2 parties. In Wisconsin, the majority of swing voters appear to be those folks who swing between voting and not voting. While 4 of the last 6 presidential elections here in Wisconsin were decided by less than a percentage point, Wisconsin is less a purple state than it is 2 states in 1. In fact, in 2020, just 9 of the state's 72 counties were decided by less than 5 percentage points. That number has been cut in half since 2000. Overall, it's been nearly 25 years since a Senate and governor candidate from different parties won on the same ballot, with voters splitting their tickets. Democrat Lena Taylor has been a state senator since 2005. She's been in the majority twice, the minority 7 times.
I think about Tommy Thompson. Now, those were really, arguably now, right, the good old days. It's when there was a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature. I believe divided government also creates a different way that
you noticed it these 4 years?
It's the difference between, do I listen to you, do I work with you, or do I bring you a takeout meal and tell you this is what we're having?
America's very polarized, in some ways calcified. Wisconsin, patient zero. Do you accept that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you look back, even before I was in office, you go back to 2000, the difference between George W. Bush and Al Gore, and then 4 years later between Bush and Kerry, was less than 1 vote per ward on average. Wisconsin had been almost perfectly even divided for now decades.
Those divisions deepened in 2011, when then Wisconsin Republican Governor Scott Walker became the first governor in nearly a decade to face a recall election after he angered labor unions and Democrats with a law called Act 10, stripping public sector unions of most of their bargaining power. Let's go back to 2011.
Yeah.
And if I told you Donald Trump's going to hijack the Republican Party in 6 years, okay, would you have done some things differently?
I think in terms of doing things, no. I mean, I come from a state that overwhelmingly leans blue, occasionally is purple. And so part of the reason when we took the actions we did as quickly as we did is we didn't know how long we'd have. So we acted right away, and then once we got success, we kept reinvesting it. Created a lot of turmoil early on, and obviously led to my recall election, which was unsuccessful.
Lena Taylor was one of the 14 Democratic state senators who left the state to deny Republicans a quorum on the Walker bill, repealing collective bargaining on benefits for public employees.
At this juncture, I can't tell you, that we're going home today, and I can't tell you we're going home tomorrow.
Look at where we are today in the country. This looks like small potatoes, what you guys are engaging in, doesn't it?
Completely. I mean, literally, one of the things that Scott Walker used to say is he couldn't even see the grass outside of his window,
Because of the protesters, yeah.
Exactly. Nowadays, you go from protesters who were peacefully protesting in 2010, right, to what we saw on January 6th. I can't tell you that I would have ever imagined, right, that something could be more divisive. I remember sitting on the Finance Committee and putting my arm on the table, and my colleague, who was a Republican, not wanting my arm and his arm to touch.
Just that tense?
It was that tense.
I was in college at the time, so...
I sat down with a group of independent voters in Waukesha to hear how they had felt at the time as the recall divided families.
But amazed at how families were willing to abandon each other because, oh, you're on this side of an issue in a way that I hadn't experienced before in life.
I think it was almost like the spark, if you will.
Did it go to another level when Trump came into the state?
Absolutely.
Trumpism?
It was a game changer. So, friends that were friends for years, all of a sudden we stopped talking to one another. Family get-togethers became a bit more strained as you felt out each other. You felt out your own parents, like, well, how did you vote and why? And the emotions were at an all-time high.
The widening gulf between the two parties exposed here during that bitterly fought recall foreshadowed the polarization that has come to define American politics today. Charles Franklin has been the director of the state's gold standard Marquette Law School poll since its inception a decade ago.
We saw the Tea Party wave in 2010 sweep out unified Democratic control, replace it with unified Republican control. And that unified control for Republicans gave them the opportunity to introduce some really major policy changes that were hugely controversial. And so the state polarized in a way after 2011 that it had largely not been polarized in earlier years.
The growing radicalization of the Republican Party and the divisions between the two parties that define national politics have been a part of Wisconsin's political experience for a decade. Central to Wisconsin's polarization is the urban-rural divide, with Dane County, home to Madison, producing huge margins for Democrats. Milwaukee, also a Democratic stronghold. But in rural Wisconsin, from 2000 to 2020, the Republican advantage in the presidential election grew from less than 3 points to nearly 20. And that divide is something Republican campaigns are trying to exploit for political gain in 2022 by focusing on crime and attempting to make Milwaukee a negative.
Mandela Barnes, wrong on crime, dangerous for Wisconsin.
Elevating the 2020 Kenosha protests after the police shooting of Jacob Blake, and last year's Waukesha parade attack to prominent political symbols, trying to capitalize on a whose side are you on style of politics, with race the not-so-subtle subtext. Before Trump's victory in 2016 by just 22,000 votes, Wisconsin had not voted for a Republican presidential nominee since 1984.
He built on a growth in the white working class that was already there. And that trend started during the Walker era, predating Trump. Trump built on that and further increased his strength with working class voters.
So let's talk about Trump for a second, because you made I still think about your press conference when you announced that you were leaving the race, and you were leaving the race with a specific reason, and was to stop Donald Trump. And you never said his name. Right. But it was obvious what you were doing. You weren't hiding it. You seemed to understand he was a threat. Did you know what kind of threat he would be to the party? And what were you worried about?
Well, two-part. I remember in 2020 saying it on your show, and I was in La Crosse when you asked a similar question. And I said I didn't know that he'd be a conservative. I mean, I was first
at that time. That's what
right.
you were
I
most
was
concerned
worried.
about.
Well, I said there needs to be a positive conservative alternative to the front runner. Didn't say his name because I didn't know. He never run for office. He never held office. I was surprised in a good way as to how effective he was on policy. I was surprised similarly in a not so good way when I realized that some of that erosion you talk about, particularly in the suburbs of Milwaukee, outside of Milwaukee County, are because of the tone. The not only women, but college-educated men and women who just didn't like the tone, even though they liked the substance.
When Wisconsin flipped in 2020 from a Trump state to a Biden state, just 2 of the state's 72 counties actually flipped red to blue, meaning it all came down to margins, including here in Waukesha, a red suburban county around Milwaukee. Democrats made slight but meaningful gains, and it's those gains that won them the state in 2020. Wisconsin has also been ground zero for Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the election. Under pressure from Trump, Republican Assembly Speaker Robin Vos hired former state Supreme Court Justice Michael Gableman to conduct a 14-month probe into the 2020 election results. Vos ultimately called Gableman an embarrassment and fired him. Gableman and Trump supported a primary challenger to Vos, who Vos beat by just 260 votes.
Adam Steen is running to defeat your rhino Speaker of the House, Robin Vos.
I know what it's like to go through a tough primary, right? I mean, I know what it's like to have to, battle for what you believe, and sometimes even with your friends, have them not necessarily, walk away thinking you're the right answer.
There are some people that say, Robin Vos, he's put his political career on the line. He stood up to Trump. And there are others that are saying his political career is on the line because he didn't stand up to Trump strong enough.
Yeah,
what critique do you accept?
Yeah, I mean, they're all valid, right? That's what everybody has the right to their own opinion. What I think that elected officials should do is do what they think is right. And sometimes that means going against your party. Most of the time not. Look, Donald Trump did a lot of good for our party. He brought a lot of new people in, a lot of energy. But now we need to make sure we focus on winning this time around. And then we'll talk about 2024. But he's not on the ballot, shouldn't be.
I jokingly tell him all the time that he used to be the extreme in his party, and now he's moderate. I will say that I think he probably didn't expect to get primaried from Trump. In the end, I think, though, it is a reflection of the lack of control that I think the Republican Party has of all of the people under their umbrella. And I think that Robin doesn't have control of that group of people.
What was your reaction to January 6th? Tweeted out pictures of the protests that took place in you a couple days after January 6th. Do you think they were the same?
Well, there were some similarities. To be clear, the day of, I commented, denounced outright. In fact, I actually made a point saying, like I did, if you denounce what happened with the riots in places like Portland and Kenosha and Madison, you should denounce that as well. And I still say to this day, anyone who was criminally involved in activity should be prosecuted. I think it should have been done more quickly, but I think without a doubt it should have been. But when I look at the larger issue of not just the people who were in the Capitol, but around that area, I said there was a lot of similarities to what happened. The only difference was it wasn't hours in my case. It was literally weeks, almost a month, that they occupied our state capitol.
Does Wisconsin heal before the country, or does the country have to heal for Wisconsin to heal?
I can't say. What would it take for either or both of the parties to be a little less homogeneous and a little more diverse in their ideology and their attachment to candidates? This is where that calcification concept, I think, does pay off. That it's very difficult for leaders in either party to really shift the lay of the land right now. The one caveat I would say is think about how much Donald Trump changed the Republican Party in the last 6 years.
Meaning somebody could do it in another state.
Exactly. Let's not be quite so myopic that we think this is the way it will always be.
When we come back, quite the conversation I have with 2 former Wisconsin governors, Republican Tommy Thompson, Democrat Jim Doyle, about how they governed a divided state. Welcome back. So, to understand how we got to this point in the state of Wisconsin and the nation, I sat down in Madison with 2 giants of Wisconsin politics. Former Republican Governor Tommy Thompson, who served from 1987 to 2001, and former Democratic Governor Jim Doyle, who served from 2003 to 2011. By the way, Doyle was also Attorney General, a state-elected position during much of Thompson's governorship. Both men knew how to win big in Wisconsin. Thompson's first margin of victory was 7 points, but he would later grow those margins to as high as 36 when he won every county but one in 1994. All of his elections were decided by 5 points or more. Doyle had some closer races than Thompson, but he still won at least 60% of the counties in both of his successful runs. By the time the current governor, Democrat Tony Evers, was elected in 2018, he only managed a 1 percentage point win. It is remarkable how much has changed in this state. And yet something Evers has in common with these predecessors is being forced to govern with the opposite party in control of the state legislature. But in Thompson and Doyle's days, compromise was not always seen as a betrayal. It was actually seen as an asset. In fact, during Thompson's 14 years in office, Democrats held one or both of the legislative chambers for 12. And during Doyle's 8 years, Republicans controlled one or both for 6. So what do these two Wisconsin Pauls from different parties, but the same bygone era of politics, have to say about where the country is today? Well, they had a lot to say. But believe it or not, they remain optimistic.
America's obviously polarized. It feels like Wisconsin is patient zero. Do you accept that?
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty wild out there. I mean, there's just so much anger, so much hatred. And I take it back, Chuck, to the fact that computers have become so successful to determine how a person is going to vote on a particular block or street. Mm-hmm. And reapportionment has allowed the computer system and the partisans to pick and choose so that a Republican district will remain Republican and a Democrat district will remain Democrat.
You get to pick your voters.
You pick your voters, and therefore, Jim and I, are friends. Yeah. But I would never, if in modern day politics, I would not want to debate him. I wouldn't even want to talk to him.
Right.
Because I'm afraid somebody from my right would run against me. Jim would feel the same way. Somebody from the George Soros left would come against him.
Right.
So we have become paralyzed because we have redistricted to such an extent that a Republican state is going to be a Republican state, a Democrat, except on a statewide ballot. But individual districts, and that has become the partisan parochialism that it is today.
Sir, would you disagree with anything he just said there?
No, I agree, but I would add this. One of the reasons Wisconsin is so much the center of this now is you look at the demographics of the state and the big divisions that have happened in the country, rural and small town against cities, big expanding economies like Madison against rural economies that are struggling. Those have happened all over. It's just in Wisconsin, when you add those up, it's a 50-50 state. So, I was the Attorney General when Governor Thompson was governor, and we certainly had our fights. But there were times that he would win 60% of the vote at the top of the ballot, right. And then the next line down would be me, and I'd win 60% of the vote. That is never going to happen.
59%. You've never gotten 60.
I got 60 in that.
It's now there are no swing voters. It's two states in one. That's what Dan Balls called it. It's really two states, right?
It has become so partisan and so divided that I would have to say it's almost two states. But I would say it's urban areas. It's Dane County and Milwaukee County, where the vast majority of the Democrat votes come from, versus rural Wisconsin. And rural Wisconsin, when Jim and I were running, used to be a lot of counties up north were very strong blue counties. They have switched over to being red. Mm-hmm. The red counties become more red. The blue counties have become a lot more blue.
So how do you de-escalate? How would you de-escalate? I'll start with you, Governor Doyle.
Well, we really do need to have nonpartisan redistricting, no question about it. And both sides, in my final 2 years as governor, after 8 years, I finally had a Democratic legislature. We had started all Republican, built up, had a Democratic legislature. I went to them in 2008 and said, let's create a nonpartisan reapportionment commission, like some states were doing. Iowa did it, Arizona done it. And I went around the state, talked to the editorial boards, not a whole lot of interest. They kind of liked it. Democrats said, 2008, at least the leadership, no, we don't have the votes. Plus, we're in the majority now. I said, you're in the majority by 2 votes. Don't count on, we're in the majority now. They thought they were going to be in the majority forever. 2010 comes along, the wave hits, and there they are. So but I really do think you have to do that. I also think, I don't know, I wish I had the answer to this. You have to put some ethics back into government. You can hit somebody hard, but you can't just lie about it. And, we would fact check every ad I ever read 100 times. We were so worried we'd get caught
there's
on
no
something.
penalty. There's no penalty. The incentive structure, there's no penalty for lying about something.
Well, that's the problem. Leadership, ethics. I'm not so sure reapportionment would change that much. It might, but the truth of the matter is, when you become so partisan and have so many people that you know exactly that the Republicans are going to win, why do you want to reach over and be bipartisan? And that's the problem all over. It's now permeated down into the school boards, and to the counties, the cities, the village, and the legislatures and Congress.
So everywhere else around the country, the first person to be blamed would be Trump. Where does the blame lie here? I'll start
lack of leadership. I really think, and I'm just not saying it's the Democrats don't have leaders. I mean, Republicans and Democrats have got to come forth and say, this just is not working. Ads, you got to have some sort of accuracy in an ad. You just can't just go out and lie about somebody.
In the digital world, you can. Yeah.
And that's what happened. And the leadership of both political parties got to come together and say, let's set up some ethics.
Where do you lie it? Where do you put it?
There's no doubt Trump is a huge factor. Whether he started it, there's a debate that's certainly understandable. He exploited it. There were divisions that he drove those divisions so deep. I've said to Tommy before, if you had told him when he was governor that some group of people wasn't voting for him, his first instinct wasn't going to be to go and call those people names. His instinct would have been, I'm going to go over there and try to get them to love me. Now, some of them would and some of them wouldn't, but that's what his instinct would have been.
I want to throw this by you, and I want both of you to respond to this. But I had one person lay out a theory that one of the reasons why Wisconsin, there's never a moment of de-escalation, is that even after the elections are too close. So if you lose by less than a percentage point, you don't go back and think, maybe my message was wrong. You think, I just registered a couple more voters. So that there's no recalibration. You don't believe the voters rejected your ideas. You just believe the other side out-organized you or outspent you. This next time I'll do it. And so you're just grinding in and grinding in. What do you think?
I think that's true. Yeah. But it goes back even before pre-Trump. It goes back even to George W. Bush. George W. Bush lost the state of Wisconsin to Al Gore by 5,700 votes. And if we remember back then, it was whether or not Al Gore was going to be president or George W. Bush. Ever since that George W. Bush, we've been so close on presidential.
It's almost like you're too close, and it's made everybody dig in.
And it's human nature. Don't blame me. Blame that other guy, Chuck. I couldn't have been wrong. And when you only have 20 or 30,000 votes and you've got over 2 million votes, it's easy to point your finger. I think it's wrong. I think elections are fair. And I think Wisconsin is a fair state. But the truth of the matter is we have to be able to disengage this partisan rhetoric.
All right. The future of this democracy, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm always optimistic.
Most former electeds are. Why are you optimistic?
Because we're Americans. We overcame the Civil War. We overcame a lot of racial disharmony. And we had 2 world wars. I think we can still save and salvage our democracy. I'm very optimistic we will.
It's one way to be optimistic when you bring up all of our bleak, right?
Yeah.
No, I'm with you. What about you, Governor?
Well, I'm optimistic only because if you don't have a democracy, what do you have? And that's pretty simple. But I will say this. I once asked that same question of a number of people, in 3 or 4 my friends who are in your business who have been covering Washington forever. And this was even before Trump. But when in 2014, 2015, and they said they've never seen the country so divided. One of them, since died, hasn't even been able to see it today. When I asked them what would it take, and this is the scary thing to me, they said they thought it was going to take some cataclysmic event.
I think so too.
Now, you would have hoped COVID would have been the cataclysmic event where we all had to pull together, we all had to, and in fact, because of how polarized we were going in, we ended up more polarized coming out. I hope that isn't true. I hope it isn't true. And this is the scary thing to me about all of these recounts and all of the stuff with what Trump's doing. It's such an attack. There were real courageous people. Richard Nixon knew that there may have been some votes in Illinois that hadn't gone his way, but for the good of the country, it's pretty historically documented. He said, I'm stepping back. Al Gore, after they had fought out Florida, said, that's it, and he did it. I defeated 3 incumbents for the jobs that I had. All people who loved the job. I've had 3 jobs, a district attorney, attorney general, a governor. I defeated an incumbent every time. They all loved the job they had. Every single one of those men who were good men and who had lost something that they wanted so badly called me up that day, that night, and congratulated me and said that they would help.
9/11, I was Secretary of Health and Human Services. I went to New York. I was the first secretary before even George W. Bush went to New York. I came back that night, and on the square around the Capitol, Democrats and Republicans were crying, embracing, singing, holding hands. And I walked in the next day with President George W. Bush to the chambers. Everybody stood up. Everybody applauded. There was such a feeling of togetherness. We are Americans. We're not Republicans and Democrats now. We are Americans, and that has got to come through loud and clear. I agree with Jim. We got to be able to come and say, you know, this democracy is worth saving, and we got to forget about our petty differences and look at the big picture.
So there you go. That's all for this edition of Meet the Press Reports. Tune in next week for our episode on securing the vote. We're going to sit down with elected officials who've been victimized by the big lie and talk to those in both parties who say they're trying to keep the system honest, but they're frightened of what might happen if they fail. I'll see you next week here on Meet the Press Reports and this Sunday on Meet the Press.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.